Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to build this floating leaf material. And the material itself is pretty straightforward. What the tricky thing here is the effects map. And we're going to use a combination of switches and randomization to get this very irregular leaf movement. I mean, the trick with getting these things to look like they're floating around is to not have any obvious direction of motion. And so what we've done is we've split it up into a variety of randomizations. Essentially, each one of these has got a different randomization on it. And what that allows us to do is to have like this really sort of, there's no discernible pattern. Obviously, there is a pattern because we're making it in the effects, but we've got enough randomization in here that it kind of looks like each one is moving separately and that there's no real connection with any kind of direction of movement. And then we can take the whole thing and move the water overall. So it just looks like, water with a bunch of leaves floating in it. Right, so let's get started. This is what it looks like. So, again, not that much going on. Everything is happening in these two effects maps, and they are, in fact, identical effects maps. And they're sharing this function right here. So that's where most of the action is happening. And with that said, let's go ahead and actually start building this thing. We're going to make a new substance, and we're going to call it floating leaves. And we're going to use the PBR template, and I'm going to stick with this 1K parent size, which is really what I'm shooting for because it's an animated material. We don't need it at 2K, and it'll make life a lot easier to animate it at 1K. First thing we're going to need to do here is sort out our output nodes. We are not going to be needing a metallic. And I'm going to move this up here, and I'm going to turn this into an opacity because I'm lazy and I don't feel like making a new node. I'm going to come into my metallic node, and all I really need to do is just change its attribution. So we're going to call this opacity, and we'll change its labels. Then we have our base color, normal. I like to have my height next to my normal because it just makes more sense in my head that way. We're going to have a roughness, and we're not going to have an ambient occlusion, but I am going to make a specular level. So again, we're just going to switch out this node here, and we're going to call it specular level. And we'll change the labels, and I will change that grayscale color to something closer like that, which will be a nice sort of place to start. And none of this stuff that we just changed in here is reflected in here. Well, the metal is because it still thinks it's metal. So we changed the assignments here on our nodes, but they're not getting reflected in our renderer until we do view outputs in 3D view. And that's going to resend that information back out to the renderer. Okay, so now we're ready to start building our material. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a very simple water onto which we're going to put everything else. So I'm going to come into my library, and I'm going to get my creased noise node. And because we're going to be making water out of this, we really do not need this at full strength. So I'm going to make this parent -3. Which makes it a lot less difficult to process. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my scale on this to 2. So I just want them smaller. And when they're talking scales here, they're talking tiling. So as the scaling numbers go up, the tiling number goes up and the actual image gets smaller. But this is super sharp. So the next thing we're going to need to do is I'm going to get a directional blur. And the difference between a directional blur and a regular blur is it's got this extra thing which tells you the angle at which you want it to blur. I'm going to keep it at 0 because I do want it to blur exactly horizontally, so we're going to leave that part alone. And I'm going to set the intensity a little bit higher. I had it in my notes at 11.34. Let's plug this into a height to normal so we can actually see what's going on. You'll notice that we're getting some artifacting here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my normal and I'm going to change my output format. I'm going to go into here, make it absolute, and then we're going to make it precision. So that'll give us, once we start taking care of this, that'll give us a nice smooth normal for the water. We're going to get rid of all of that using other things like these lines and stuff because we're not done with our water yet. Okay, next thing we're going to need is a transform 2D and a blend. And we're going to start putting some more variety in here. So I'm going to use a light and blend, and I'm going to start combining these guys. So let's see how that works. I'm basically just trying to, I had it pretty much just halfway through. I eyeballed it. But instead of having just one big wave arc, now we've got a bunch of little wave arcs. And they seem to be, it's got a certain directionality to it. And we're going to kind of repeat that. So I'm going to get another blend, and I'm going to get another transform 2D. And we're going to make this a light and blend as well. And we're going to make this a little bit smaller, I think, so probably something like that. And again, we can place it in a position that we like. And when it, we're just trying to get it choppier and choppier and choppier, and that's kind of what's happening, except we're getting these really hard edges here, so we're going to put in another blur. But this time, not a directional blur, just a regular blur. And we're going to kind of fuzz the whole thing up. And I had this set in at 7.92. Yeah, that kind of works. So what's happening now is we've taken all, we've kind of chopped it up and then we've smoothed it all out again. So this is starting to look more like water. But it's still not animated. So for now, let's come in here and we're just going to put something quick on the disorder here. We're going to change this later once we start putting input parameters, but for now, let's just get, I wanted a variable, I did not want a constant. We're going to get our $time, and we're going to slow it down. So I had 0.1 in here, and we'll multiply these two together, and we'll set this as the output node, and that will give us our basic water animation. So let's publish it out and see what that looks like so far. And there we go. Yeah, that's pretty good. That's only half our water. We're going to add a little bit more into it, but that's a good start for it. So now let's do the second half of our water. I am going to get a purlin noise. And we'll get another one of these guys. That's crazy. So we're going to have to set this one down. And I will set the height depth. In my notes, I had it down at 5.42, a little more subtle. And this one also, we copied it, but we also want this at HDR high precision. Because otherwise, if you don't, you get like, well, I guess it's not showing up here. You can get like you can get weird artifacting in the normals if you don't have high precision. So we're going to spend the extra processing to make it look right. Now again, it's unnecessary to have this purlin noise at full strength. So we're also going to make it parent -3. And let's get a blend now. Move the whole thing over here. And we're going to blend these two together. I think we forgot to set the height on this because this looks too low compared to this. I mean, we're trying to match these guys up. Oh, and that's the other thing. Looking at this, that looks terrible. That looks terrible because it's not at parent size. So both of these height to normals we're going to want to set in at relative to parent, because we want to bump that resolution back up to what it needs to be. And then going forward, everything's going to get this parent-sized input. But this, we're also going to set up, I had it set up at a crazy number, which was about 59. And that's just what's in my notes. I want to look at them together here because sometimes those numbers are different when you do them a second time. And we're going to do this as an overlay blend. And we're going to overlay these two movements together. So that's the choppy purlin noise, and that's the larger thing we've got going on in here. I think this purlin noise is too high. I'm going to lower that down a bit, because I want to be able to sort of combine the two of them together here. That looks about right. Let's see what that looks like when we animate it. Oh, you know, it's only half animated. We forgot to animate the purlin noise. Let's go back and do that. For the moment, I'm just going to copy what I've got going on in here. And I'm going to apply it to the disorder in the purlin noise as well. They're gonna end up with the same animation throughout. So whatever I put in that purlin is what I'm going to be putting in the larger construction that we made. Okay, let's try that again. I think I want to see a couple of things. I want to see this purlin noise larger. It'll help it move as well. Let's bring that scale down somewhat. That's probably better. Yeah, that looks more like it. So we'll call this the root of our basic water, and this is what we're going to build it all off of. Now, before we move on to the next thing, I want to add a couple more things to our water. I'm going to come back into my library, and I'm going to get a normal to height. I'm going to get the regular one, not the HQ, because we don't really have that much detail going on in here. And you will notice that this is a pretty expensive node, and I don't really need to get anything other than the most basic height information, because, you know, it's just this very wishy-washy water. So again, I'm going to come back into the output size, and I'm going to do this parent -4. And I'm going to use this now to create my color and my height maps. Now, this would make a crazy height map. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this information and we're just going to globally just darken it up. It's still going to move around a little bit, but we're going to be putting other things on top of it. So I want this to be the very lowest of my heights. So that's probably okay to start. We might change it later, but for now we'll leave it here. And I'm also going to put in a gradient map because I don't want my water exactly all the same color, but I do want it almost exactly all the same color. So I'm going to pick a color I like for my water, something like that. Actually, I think I'm going to copy this one so I get exactly the same color, and I'm going to click on that one and I'm going to paste it. So we're dealing with the same two blues, and I'm just going to change it ever so slightly. So there's a little bit of variety in the color, but it's very subtle. But I just think it makes it look nicer than having a solid. So this is going to be our water color, and this is going to be our water height. And we might as well plug in the height and the color and start getting rid of these temporary colors. And again, because I've lowered them down, this is like super small now. We're going to bring these back up to parent size. Okay. You know what? I'm going to see whether, does it work better at 3? Nope. Okay. We're going to leave it apparent -4. Yeah, sometimes there's a sweet spot. Sometimes if you bring it up a little bit, it'll actually process a little bit better. So it pays to double check. And each node is a little bit different. But we'll leave it there for now. Okay, so that's our water done. The next thing we're going to work on is the mask that we're going to be using in our effects map. So this is whatever our floaty stuff is. I've already got these two guys in my original test. I could also pull them out of my library. I happen to have my personal files set up in here, so I have a video on how to hook up your library, and I'm just going to grab a couple of these guys and we're going to bring them in as our masks. And I'm going to want them grayscale, so that's the first thing I'm going to do. And then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to get some more noises. So I'm going to get a Gaussian noise, and I'm going to also get cells 1. Now the Gaussian noise, I'm not going to need it full strength, so again, I'm going to make this parent -2. The cells I'm going to keep at parent size. And we're going to use these two to get some sort of details in these leaves for our colors and normals and stuff. So let's get a warp node. And I'm going to take my cells 1 and I'm going to warp it by my Gaussian noise, but not by that much. I had the intensity, actually, you know what, I also set the parent size down on this one as well. I'm looking at my notes, but I set it down by 1. And then the warp intensity I had very, very low. I had it down at 0.19. And this is going to be like all the veiny bits in the leaves. So that looks about right. And I'm going to stick levels node in here. And we're going to get a couple of blend nodes. And we're going to use a darken blend. And we're going to combine our leaves and their little veins. So I'm going to duplicate that. So I have 2 blend nodes with darken blends on them. And we will just do that. So we have these leaves and they've got like this veiny stuff on them. But they're kind of perfect, and that's going to be the next thing that we're going to deal with. I want to pop some holes in these because, you know, if they're floating on the water, chances are they're kind of messed up a little bit. So we're going to continue to use this noise that we made here rather than make anything new, but I don't want it to be on the same scale. So I'm going to take this transform 2D node and I'm going to double this size. So I'm going to hit ×2 and that's just going to double the size of it. Then we're going to get a levels node and we're going to turn this into a mask because it's giving us this nice organic mask. So I am just going to pop some holes in here. Oh, I don't want that. I want a new blend node, sorry. And this is going to be a copy. So we're literally just cutting these holes out. No, we want it on the top. So it's going to give us, because it's a grayscale, it's going to give us a black background. So it's chopping out some holes. And obviously you can get these how you want. If you don't want holes in your leaves, then skip this step. And now we have something that we can actually feed into an effects map. So I'm getting my effects map and I'm going to turn it into a grayscale. And we're going to plug in our 2 images here. I'm going to right click, edit effects map. And we're going to start building this thing. Now, before I go any further, I want to talk a little bit about switches. Let's get another quadrant in here. I'm going to press spacebar. I'm going to hit quadrant. And because I had that highlighted, it's just adding a quadrant to here. And then without having anything highlighted, I'm going to add another quadrant. I'm going to duplicate this, and we're going to experiment for a little bit. I'm going to attach this switch in here, and we're going to just take a look at what it is that switches do before we go any further. This quadrant, I'm going to set, well, first we're going to set them both to get our input image. And then I'm going to set this to 0, and we're going to do the same thing to this other one, except we're going to have it as image 1. And let's set the pattern in there to input image. All right, so right now, all I'm seeing as the output for my quadrant is image 0. This is image 1, right? And this is image 0. If I come back into my switch, I can select which of these final quadrants I'm shooting all of this randomization info into. All right. So if I have the selector on the left, it'll select the left-hand image. If I have it on the right, it'll select the right-hand image. That's all it does. It's very, very limited in what it can do, but it does have a function on here. So what it means is that we can create a function that is going to randomly switch between one or the other for us. So it's either going to pop out image 0 or it's going to pop out image 1. And the other thing that I want to do with these leaves is I want to limit the number that I'm going to be shooting out into my final effects map output, because we're not trying to cover everything. In fact, we just want to have a very few leaves. We're not making, ground cover. We just want a couple of random leaves floating around in the water. So we're going to want to cull it a little bit too. And, there's a bunch of different ways to do that. And I just fooled around with my quadrants and my switches until I came up with something that I'm happy with. And you don't necessarily have to do it like this, but this is how we're going to do it. It's just important that you understand the concept of switch, because whatever you're going to end up doing, you're going to want to use the switches. So I'm going to add another quadrant in here, and I'm going to add another quadrant in here. And what those quadrants do is they are changing down the size of what image we're putting out here. And the way that I'm going to now cull the herd a little bit is I'm only going to pick one of these quadrants for my output. So we've kind of mixed things up in here, but then we're just really filtering out just one section out of all of this that we did. And that's going to make things much thinner on the ground once we get to the end of our chain. So we're going to have now, this is the end of our chain. So we're going to have an input image, and the first one we're going to have as 0, and then we're going to duplicate this, and this one I'm going to have as 1. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing over here. So this final switch will either pick all the randomization that's coming down this chain. The result it's going to pick to show as either image 1, or as image 0 rather, or image 1. And it'll do it on both sides. So we're going to end up, in the end, with only 2 quadrants worth of information. And then the actual image in that quadrant will be randomized according to this final switch. It'll make more sense as we start to do it. But I want to get this set up in here because we're actually going to be working on it externally. So the architecture needs to be in here if we want to see our results as we work on them. You see them? Those are our little leaves there. We have to get rid of, actually, we've got images on this one. So we're going to get rid of that. I'm going to bring this back up to, oh, I had them on this one, sorry. So I'm going to go back into these 2 that we were experimenting with, and we're going to get rid of that pattern. And now all we're left with is the actual ones that we're going to be dealing with. There we go. So it's switched it twice. I mean, it's doing, but we're going to be putting randoms on these. So in fact, let's do that now. So we have our actual FX map set up before we go into our external. So I'm highlighting my switch. In my selector, I'm going to create an empty function. And the result it wants is a Boolean, because it's a switch. It's going either true or false. I mean, they're giving it different names left and right, but it's still true and false. So we're going to want a random, and we're going to get a constant. We're going to make that a number 1. We're going to get another constant, and we're going to get a comparison. So I'm going to get, well, I'm just going to do lower. It doesn't really matter. You'll see in a minute. And then we want a constant Boolean, and we want this to set this to true. Oh, and then we're going to also need an if then. Okay. So I'm going to create a random number. If this random number between 0 and 1 is less than 0.5, we're going to have the switch to true. Otherwise, well, it's blank by default, is going to be false. So we're going to set this at the output node. And you can see that stuff's beginning to happen with what it's sending through to the end. And we're just going to apply this very same function to all of our switches. And what it's going to mean is that it's a 50-50 shot, more or less, one way or another, which direction it's going to go. It's either going to go left or it's going to go right. So we'll make an empty function here. We'll paste that in. We'll set that as the output node. And ditto for this one. I mean, it's all crazy in here, but you can see what's going on now is it's starting to switch things up. I mean, they're all in a grid pattern, but baby steps. So we've got 2 different kinds of leaves. Again, it's a 50-50 shot one way or another. And then it's also a 50-50 shot exactly where they're starting to pop up on the effects map. And once we start putting that function we're going to make in here, it's going to start looking like what we need it to do. We have one more thing that we need to do in here before we move on, and that is change the random seed on each one of these outputs, because that's going to even further mess them up, if you will, and get them each one to be different. Because what we're trying to do here in the end is have a situation where each one of these quadrants is functioning pretty much independently from all the other ones, and they're like completely unconnected in their randomness. So they're not using the same random seeds, and what is actually getting shot into any given quadrant is also randomized. And this is going to help with that overall effect of having the leaves kind of going all over the place. This first quadrant we're going to leave alone because the random seed is at 0. And I'm just going to go up the chain, and it doesn't matter what you put in there, but each one has got to be a different one from all the others. So I'm just going to go 0, 1, 2, 3. And that's going to, each one of these now is on a completely different random track. Right, so that's the basic architecture of our effects map. The next thing I want to do is to come in here. Well, the next thing I'm going to do actually is, we shouldn't have set these up. I'm going to get rid of these guys because it's going to be super hard to test what's going on. They're all going to be identical in the end. And when I'm testing my functions, I really only just want to look at one of them. So that's the setup. We'll reset it up, but for now we're just going to get rid of these guys. And we're only going to deal with whatever is coming out of here. And then we'll replace them later. And now I'm going to come in here. I'm going to assign variables to the various things that we're going to be wanting to change. So we're going to want to change the offset, we're going to want to change the size, and we're going to want to change the rotation. And I've got nothing made for these yet, but I'm going to come into each one of these and I'm going to get the correct variable. So my pattern offset is going to need a float 2, and I'm going to manually type in what I will eventually be creating, which will be my leaf offset. And I'll set this as the output node. It's not going to change anything in here because it's all just nothing right now. I'm going to do the same thing with the pattern size, empty function, pattern size is going to want a float 2. You can always check down here what it's going to want. So I'm going to get variable float 2, and I'm going to call this leaf size. And I'll set this as the, did I get a float 1? Let's try that again. Now it will let me set it as an output node because it is the correct type of float. And then finally, we're going to set our pattern rotation. And here we do want to float 1. And we're going to call this leaf rotation. Oh, let's make sure we spell that right. Because spelling it right is important, otherwise it won't work. Okay, so we've got this one singular thing going on. We've got our stuff set up in the actual spots where we need it. And eventually, just like normal, we're going to be doing it all off of what's going on in this color luminosity. But we're going to do it as an external function. So we're ready to actually get in there. We have nothing to put in here yet. Let's come into our project. I'm going to right click, new substance function. And we're going to rename this, and we're going to call this leaves effects. And it's giving me this warning because it's got no output. And that's what we're going to do now. We'll just start with something simple. I'm just going to put in the random. We're going to need a bunch of these actually. Let's just do our offsets quickly. We'll get the number 1. We're going to vector a float 2 out of this. We're going to set, you see now this is where I screw up. I always forget what I call my things. So I'm going to have to come back into my original effects map and remind myself what it was that I called these outputs. Okay, so leaf offset. Wasn't sure if it was leaves or leaf. So I'm going to paste that in here. And then we're going to want a sequence. And because we're going to be putting this on the color luminosity channel, I'm going to finish it off with a 1. So in here I'm basically making what it is that I'm going to be doing in my effects map. And I'm doing it in this external function because it's going to let me use it twice, because right now we only have one effects map. We're going to end up with 2 of them. And this will mean that we only have to mess around with the one function. And it's actually more efficient because there's one function as opposed to 2 doing exactly the same thing. But now that I've got this external function created and it has an output node, so that warning sign went away, I can come back into my original effects map. I can come into my quadrant that we're going to be doing as our template, make an empty function on that color luminosity, bring in my leaves effects, and set this as my output node. And it has randomized the location of our leaves. They're no longer on a grid anymore. So that's how that works. And now what we can do is we can start working on this external function, and we're going to see the results of it in here. So that's pretty cool. So let's start working on this. And the first thing I want to do is deal with the static stuff, which is primarily the size. And we'll set up the animated stuff, and then we'll worry about the animations later. So we'll set up a lot of the animated stuff as static first, and then we can always replace that. Okay, so let's start with the size because that's the truly static one as far as animations go. I'm going to get another sequence because we're going to need that. I'm also going to get another constant. What I'm doing here is I'm setting up a floor and a ceiling for the size of my leaves. So this is an aesthetic choice. I'm just going to go ahead and build it the way I had it built because I liked the sizes that I have, but you can have the sizes any way you want and the concept remains the same. So we're going to get a random, and I'm going to pick for my size a random number between 0 and 1.5. And I'm just going to get a bunch of other things that I need, and we'll build it after I get them. Okay. I've got a couple more constants. So these are the numbers that I came up with. Not 854, 0.854. If this random number between 0 and 1.5 is greater than 0.854, then I'm just going to go ahead and use that random number. Otherwise, I'm going to add this number to it to make it bigger. And that number I came up with was 0.889. And we can see what happens as we adjust this out. So I want them to be like proportional. So I want them to keep their proportions. So this is going to be the same number for the x and the y. So I'm just going to vector this out into a float too. And then we need to actually create our variable. So we had this leaf size, I believe. I'm going to find out in a minute if that's correct. Yeah, I don't think that's the right. Oh, let's do that first. Yeah, we go. So that's our floor right there. So I can set that, you know, what's the smallest I want it to be. So I have it hooked up, and that's why it's a pretty big number. I mean, they're all more or less the same size. So we're talking about a pretty narrow band, but you may have other things floating around in your water, and you may want different size ratios for them. But that's how you get it. So here's your ceiling, and this is your floor. Okay, so our leaf size is set in. Let me make a frame. This is going to get big. You can also put frames in your functions. We've got our temporary offset set in here. And let's get a temporary rotation set in. So for now, we can just go ahead and do this. We'll get another sequence. Oh, you know what we forgot to do? We forgot to actually send it out. We're missing a node here. So we're going to set that node before we send it out. And this is called leaf rotation. And we spelt it right. We can tell because they've started to rotate. So that's random for us now. So we've got our basic groups set up in here, and now all we have to do is sort of add in our animations, etc. Now, before we go any further, let's come back in here and hook this up so we can see what's going on when we publish it out vis-a-vis our rotations. So I'm going to add a frame, and we'll call this leaf mask. And for right now, because I'm not really worrying about the water, I'm worrying about the leaves, I'm going to do this, and we just get a blank one of these guys, and a blank one of these guys, and we'll just put in some temporary stuff in there. So, you know, all we're just watching our animation at this point. So we can come back to our leaves effects, and we can start working on that. Now, later, I think the simplest way to do this is to do it without variables first, because that's just going to fine-tune the basic animation. So I'm going to build this right now, correcting for my top speed for everything, because then we can go in and use the variables to cut down on the speed. So since we left rotation, we might as well start here. I want my leaves to be able to rotate, and we're going to want to be able to adjust that. But basically what it is a, you know, multiple of $ time. So what I had come up with, and I'm just going to put in it as a constant right now, I ended up liking time times 0.1 as the top speed for my leaf rotations. So we've already got this random number here, and all we really need to do is add the timeline to whatever is getting popped out of here as a random, because this is basically its starting point, and then we're going to put it on a timer. So that'll be our leaf rotation. And let's see what happens when we publish this out. And there they go. And that's the fastest our leaves will turn. So if you want your floaty things to go faster or slower, this is where you decide what your top speed is. All right, so far so good. Leaf size is going to be left alone. Actually, let's make a frame about this. Now, far and away, the most involved animation is going to be coming on our offset. And we're going to have a lot of moving parts here. Okay, the first thing I want to address with the offset is the direction of movement. I want that random. I want it to be a 50-50 shot, whether it's moving in the positive or in the negative. So again, we're going to need a couple of random nodes because I want this to apply to differently to the X and the Y. So they're moving independently of each other. Actually, let's just make one and we'll just copy the whole thing out. So we're going to kind of build the same idea that we did for the switches, where it's a 50-50 shot of whether it's going to move in one direction or another. Negation. So if this random number between 0 and 1 is greater than 0.5, then this is a -1. Otherwise, it's a +1. And this replaces the regular old one in terms of any kind of randomizations we've got going forward. And I'm going to duplicate this. So we can have our X and our Y going in opposite directions if that's what the 50-50 shot means. So that's the first part of it. Then we're going to have two different kinds of movement. We're going to have our regular XY movement, so essentially speed. And we're also going to put in a swing. So we're going to do something on a wave. So they will simultaneously be moving along the X and the Y while also swinging. And both of these things are going to be random. So we're getting a lot of random up in here. Let's start with the speed because that's the simplest one. And I'm going to get a couple more nodes. And again, this 0.01 is what I have designated my top speed for these leaves. So this is going to get replaced eventually by our input parameters once we get those going. In the meantime, where's our time? Pretty sure I got one of those. There we go. Let's move that in the middle. So that's going to be what's on our timer right now, and we're going to add something up in here once we get our variables going. And let's get a couple more multiplications. We're going to add more to it, but let's take a look at what this looks like so far. What we do at the very end is add all this stuff into these random numbers. Let's see if this works. Yeah, they're spinning and they're slowly moving in a direction. Yeah, we're getting there. So the last movement that we're adding in here is the swing. So that's based on a wave. So it's going to swing from one direction to the other. Now, we're going to keep the frequency at 1. That's a static. And again, we're going to have variables later on that are going to be dealing with the wave. But my top speed for anything that's going on amplitude-wise. So this is the well, it's not the top speed. This is the maximum arc, if you will, of my swing. So it's a pretty small number. I mean, I don't want them swinging wildly. I just want them kind of gently kind of doing that. And we are going to have this feed into the random numbers that we are using for our offset, because what we're doing is we're constantly shifting the offset. Now, as it stands right now, this is a problem if I plug it in directly, because if you think about it, this wave, as this little graph implies, is crossing through 0, right? So if my random node is creating a random number between 0 and whatever number I'm feeding in here, you can see the problem is that we're going to be dealing with some very small numbers, and also 0, and I don't want either of those things. So before I send it into here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the number 1, which is going to simplifying my life. I mean, basically it's gonna make a random number between 1 and a number that's a little bit bigger than 1. So it's hovering around the number 1, but it's not exactly 1. And then this is going to be our random number. So this is going to be the top speed of our swing. And let's take a look at that. So they're going back and forth, but they're also moving forward and they're also spinning around. And this is as fast as they will go. And these are the numbers that I was happy with. But, I mean, you could have other stuff floating in water that behaves differently. So get it all sorted out here. You know, we've got the different sections. We've got the side to side. Put a box around that. We've got our side to side. We've got our positive or negative movement. And we've got our speed. So this is the basic architecture of what we're going, you know, of our movement, and I'm pretty happy with it. I think it looks good, but we now have to add into this the sliders.